The desert wind carried ash and diesel fumes across the command tent as Bernard Montgomery set down his binoculars. November 4th, 1942. Through the haze of burning German vehicles stretching toward the horizon, the Field Marshal watched Rommel's once-invincible Afrika Korps hemorrhaging westward in disarray. 12 days of grinding battle had shattered the axis between two armies that had danced across North Africa for 2 years. Now, finally, the music had stopped. Montgomery turned to his staff officers, his thin face betraying no emotion beyond a slight tightening at the corners of his mouth. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man who measured every syllable, "the prisoner count is rising by the hour. Rommel's line has collapsed completely." He paused, allowing himself the briefest moment of satisfaction. "The Marshal has made a balls of it." The profanity, crude by Montgomery's typically austere standards, revealed more than celebration. It exposed the calculated fury of a commander who had spent 3 months transforming a defeated army into a weapon sharp enough to cut through the Desert Fox's mystique. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most decisive moments, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. This story gets even more intense. But to understand what Montgomery said when he realized the trap had closed, you must first understand the man who spoke those words and the desperate situation that preceded them. 3 months earlier, the situation could hardly have been more different. August 1942 found the British Eighth Army clinging to a narrow defensive line at El Alamein, barely 100 kilometers west of Alexandria. Beyond Alexandria lay Cairo. Beyond Cairo, the Suez Canal, Britain's jugular vein connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, the lifeline of the empire. If Rommel seized the canal, Britain's entire strategic position in the Middle East would collapse like a house built on desert sand. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Lose El Alamein, lose Egypt, lose the war in Africa, perhaps lose the war entirely. The Eighth Army knew this arithmetic in their bones. They had retreated across 800 miles of desert, fighting and falling back and fighting, watching Tobruk fall, watching Gazala turn into a graveyard, watching Rommel perform tactical miracles that turned British advantages into German victories. The men were exhausted, not just in body but in spirit. They had fought well and fought hard, yet Rommel always seemed one move ahead, his Afrika Korps and Italian divisions executing the kind of fluid, aggressive warfare that left the British command structure tangled in its own communications wire. Morale, that intangible currency of armies, had plummeted. Officers spoke quietly of contingency plans. Engineers prepared defensive positions back in the Nile Delta. Maps showed multiple fallback lines. Everyone knew what nobody wanted to say aloud. They were preparing to retreat again, preparing to abandon El Alamein, just as they had abandoned everything else between Gazala and the current line. The atmosphere, as one observer noted, was thick with doubt, heavy with the anticipation of failure. Into this psychological morass walked Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery on August 13, 1942. He was not supposed to be there. The command should have gone to Lieutenant General William Gott, but Gott's transport plane had been shot down 2 days earlier, eliminating him from the war and from history in one brutal instant. Churchill and the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, scrambled for a replacement. They chose Montgomery, a thin, ascetic officer known for his abrasive personality and his unconventional methods. He was, by reputation, difficult, demanding, and entirely convinced of his own genius. He was also, his supporters argued, exactly what the situation required. Montgomery arrived in Cairo and immediately traveled to the headquarters of the Eighth Army near El Alamein. What he found appalled him. The command post sat in a location he would later describe as a frightful place, depressing, unhealthy, and a rendezvous for every fly in Africa. More concerning than the geography was the mentality. Within hours of his arrival, Montgomery called together his senior officers. He stood before them, this spare figure with sharp features and sharper eyes, and spoke words that would echo through the ranks like a detonation. "I want, first of all, to introduce myself to you," he began, his voice calm, conversational. "You do not know me. I do not know you. But we have got to work together. Therefore, we must understand each other, and we must have confidence, each in the other." The officers waited. They had heard speeches before. Montgomery continued, "I have only been here a few hours, but from what I have seen and heard since I arrived, I am prepared to say, here and now, that I have confidence in you." Then the hammer fell. "I do not like the general atmosphere I find here," Montgomery said, his tone hardening. "It is an atmosphere of doubt, of looking back to select the next place to which to withdraw, of loss of confidence in our ability to defeat Rommel, of desperate defense measures by reserves in preparing positions in Cairo and the Delta." He let those words settle, watching his officers shift uncomfortably. "All that must cease. Let us have a new atmosphere." Montgomery laid out his vision with the precision of an engineer drafting blueprints. The defense of Egypt, he explained, existed here, at El Alamein and the Rufaisat Ridge, not in the Delta, not in Cairo. Here. "What is the use of digging trenches in the Delta?" he demanded. "It is quite useless. If we lose this position, we lose Egypt. All the fighting troops now in the Delta must come here at once, and will." Then came the declaration that would define his command, the words that turned doubt into steel. "Here we will stand and fight. There will be no further withdrawal. I have ordered that all plans and instructions dealing with further withdrawal are to be burnt, and at once. We will stand and fight here." He paused, letting that sink in. The burning of the contingency plans, the elimination of the psychological escape route. Then he delivered the line that would ripple through the Eighth Army like an electric current. "If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead." The silence in that tent must have been profound. Montgomery had been in command for mere hours, yet he spoke with absolute certainty. He wasn't requesting commitment, he was demanding it. He wasn't suggesting a strategy, he was declaring a reality. Some officers likely felt inspired, others probably felt trapped. But all of them understood that something fundamental had shifted. The retreat was over, not because the tactical situation had improved, but because Montgomery said it was over. But Montgomery wasn't simply offering rhetoric. He explained the concrete reasons for his confidence. Fresh divisions were arriving from the United Kingdom, the 51st Highland Division and the 44th Home Counties Division. 300 to 400 new Sherman tanks were being unloaded at Suez at that very moment. The Prime Minister himself had issued a directive, written on half a sheet of notepaper: "Destroy the Axis forces in North Africa." Montgomery had the mandate, the reinforcements, and the plan. He also had intelligence. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had cracked German military communications, giving Montgomery access to Rommel's plans, his supply situation, his intentions. Montgomery knew that Rommel was exhausted, his forces stretched thin, his logistics strained to the breaking point. The Desert Fox was preparing one more offensive, hoping to break through before British reinforcements tilted the balance irrevocably. Montgomery knew it was coming. "Rommel can attack as soon as he likes," Montgomery told his officers, "and I hope he does." That hope was genuine. Montgomery had identified the fundamental weakness in Rommel's approach. The German commander excelled at fluid, mobile warfare, but El Alamein offered no room for maneuver. The position was anchored on the north by the Mediterranean Sea and on the south by the Katra Depression, an impassable morass of salt marsh and quicksand. The front was only 30 miles wide. There was no southern flank to turn, no wide-open desert where Rommel could execute his trademark sweeping movements. At El Alamein, it would be strength against strength, attrition against attrition. And Montgomery, with his growing material superiority, welcomed that kind of fight. Rommel attacked on August 31st at the Battle of Alamein exactly as Montgomery had predicted. The German armor drove south, then hooked north toward the Alamein Ridge, a low elevation just behind British lines. Montgomery had reinforced that ridge heavily, positioning infantry, artillery, and anti-tank guns in carefully prepared positions. He explicitly ordered his tank commanders not to engage in mobile combat. The tanks would remain in reserve, conserved for future operations. The infantry and guns would do the killing. For 3 days, Rommel's panzers hammered against Alamein. For 3 days, British gunners poured fire into the German tanks. The Afrika Korps made no significant gains. Supply shortages, petrol, ammunition, water strangled the offensive. RAF aircraft dominated the skies, bombing German positions with near impunity. On September 2nd, Rommel broke off the attack and withdrew. It was the first time in the Desert War that the Afrika Korps had attacked and been decisively repulsed without forcing a British retreat. Montgomery did not pursue. His armor remained in reserve. His infantry held their positions. Critics would later question this decision, arguing that a vigorous counterattack might have destroyed Rommel's weakened forces. But Montgomery operated according to his own philosophy. He would fight when ready, not before, and he would fight according to his plan, not his enemies. Alamein had been a defensive victory. The offensive would come later, when Montgomery had assembled overwhelming force and prepared every detail. For 2 months, the 8th Army trained, prepared, and reinforced. Montgomery moved his headquarters to the coast, to a location where officers could live comfortably and work efficiently alongside Desert Air Force Command. He created reserves of ammunition, fuel, vehicles. He formed a corps de chasse, a mobile armored reserve modeled on Rommel's own Afrika Korps, designed to exploit breakthroughs once the infantry created them. He drilled his divisions relentlessly, practicing coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. He visited units personally, delivering speeches, explaining his plan, building confidence. Soldiers began to believe they could win. Officers stopped thinking about retreat and started thinking about victory. Montgomery planned to attack in late October during the full moon, when nighttime movement would be possible. The plan, codenamed Operation Lightfoot, was methodical and brutal. Infantry would attack at night, creating narrow corridors through Rommel's minefields. Engineers would clear paths for tanks. Artillery would saturate German positions with shells. The offensive would grind forward through sheer weight of men and metal, accepting casualties in exchange for territorial gains, forcing Rommel to commit his mobile reserves to static defensive fighting where British material superiority would tell. Once the German armor was worn down, the corps de chasse would break through and pursue. It was not elegant. It was not creative. But Montgomery believed it would work. October 23rd arrived. At 9:40 p.m., 1,000 British guns opened fire simultaneously, the largest artillery barrage since the Western Front in World War I. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the earth and shredded the night. For 15 minutes, shells rained on German and Italian positions. Then the infantry went forward, crossing the start line into the minefields, into the fire, into history. The Second Battle of El Alamein had begun. For 12 days, the armies tore at each other in the most savage fighting of the North African campaign. The infantry battles were intimate and terrible. Bayonet charges, point-blank grenade exchanges, men dying in the dark among the mines. The armor battles were mechanical slaughterhouses, tanks burning, crews roasting, metal ripping through metal. The artillery duels were impersonal mass murder, guns firing at map coordinates, shells arriving unannounced, bodies disintegrating without warning. Montgomery's plan unfolded with grinding inevitability. The infantry opened corridors. The tanks pushed through, took losses, pushed further. Rommel, who had been in Germany on medical leave, rushed back to Africa and threw his reserves into the fight. The panzer divisions counterattacked repeatedly, bleeding themselves against British defensive positions. Montgomery adjusted his tactics, shifting his main effort from the northern to the southern sector, then back north again, keeping Rommel off balance, preventing the German commander from concentrating his forces effectively. By November 2nd, Rommel understood the mathematics. His armor was shattered, reduced to barely 30 operational tanks. His infantry divisions had been mauled. His fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. His ammunition stocks were running low. British forces, meanwhile, seemed inexhaustible, replacing losses, continuing to attack, grinding forward meter by meter. Rommel made the only rational decision. He ordered a retreat. Then Adolf Hitler intervened. On November 3rd, a message arrived from the Führer's headquarters. In the situation in which you find yourself, there can be no other thought but to stand fast, yield not a yard of ground, and throw every gun and every man into the battle. Considerable Air Force reinforcements are being sent to Commander-in-Chief South. The Dukes and the Commando Supremo are also making the utmost efforts to send you the means to continue the fight. Your enemy, despite his superiority, must also be at the end of his strength. It would not be the first time in history that a strong will has triumphed over the bigger battalions. As to your troops, you can show them no other road than that to victory or death. Rommel complied. He had been a loyal officer his entire career. He halted the retreat and ordered his forces to hold their positions. It was a catastrophic decision, not militarily, but politically imposed. The Afrika Korps, which might have conducted an organized withdrawal, preserving much of its strength, instead remained in place while British forces completed their breakthrough. November 4th brought the collapse. British armor finally broke through the German lines at Tel el-Akakir. Rommel's front disintegrated. Units retreated piecemeal, abandoning equipment, surrendering in large groups. The organized army of the previous day became a fleeing mob. Rommel countermanded Hitler's order and ordered a general retreat, knowing he might face court-martial, but understanding that remaining meant annihilation. Montgomery stood in his command post receiving reports of the breakthrough. Prisoner counts rose by the hour. German and Italian units were surrendering en masse. The minefields that had channeled British attacks now trapped retreating Axis forces, funneling them into killing zones where artillery and aircraft massacred them. Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps, the force that had seemed invincible 18 months earlier, was running for its life across the desert it had once dominated. It was in this moment, watching the culmination of 3 months of preparation, that Montgomery delivered his assessment of Rommel's performance. Speaking to his staff officers, observing the chaos of the German retreat, he remarked with characteristic bluntness, "The Marshal has made a balls of it." Hemorrhaging, the crude phrase, so unlike Montgomery's usual formal demeanor, carried layers of meaning. On one level, it was simple statement of fact. Rommel had indeed failed, his attempt to hold the line after November 2nd, turning an orderly retreat into a rout. But the comment also revealed Montgomery's professional assessment of his opponent. Throughout the campaign, Allied propaganda had portrayed Rommel as a military genius, a superhuman tactician whose brilliance compensated for material disadvantages. Montgomery never accepted that narrative. He saw Rommel as skilled but not infallible, aggressive but predictable, brave but ultimately defeatable by careful planning and superior resources. The comment at the moment of victory was Montgomery's way of puncturing the Rommel myth. The Desert Fox had been outthought and outfought, but Montgomery's words during and after El Alamein revealed more than his assessment of Rommel. They exposed his entire philosophy of command. Back in August, when he arrived at a defeated army, he had not offered complex tactical analyses or brilliant strategic insights. Instead, he had offered certainty. "We will stand and fight here," he had declared. "If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead." Those words were not literally true. Montgomery had no intention of staying there dead. He intended to win. But the statement served a psychological purpose. It eliminated doubt. It removed the option of retreat from the mental calculus of every officer and soldier. And by removing that option, it freed the Army to focus entirely on winning. During the battle itself, Montgomery had spoken with equal confidence. When Rommel attacked at Alamein in September, Montgomery reportedly remarked that the man must be mad for attacking into prepared British positions. When the October offensive bogged down in brutal attritional fighting, Montgomery remained outwardly calm, insisting the battle was proceeding according to plan. Whether that was entirely true is debatable. The initial breakthrough proved slower than anticipated, forcing Montgomery to adjust his tactics multiple times. But his public confidence never wavered. To his subordinates, to his soldiers, to the press, Montgomery projected absolute certainty that victory was inevitable. After the breakthrough, as the Afrika Korps retreated westward, Montgomery continued to speak of the battle in terms that emphasized not luck or chance, but preparation and execution. He had planned methodically. He had accumulated superior forces. He had attacked when ready. He had ground down the enemy's strength through attritional warfare. The result, in his view, was never in doubt. The desert fox had been trapped, not by genius or inspiration, but by arithmetic and logistics and careful planning. Winston Churchill, watching from London as reports of the victory arrived, understood the significance immediately. He had endured 2 years of defeats in North Africa, 2 years of watching Rommel drive British forces backward despite British numerical advantages. Now, finally, the tide had turned. Churchill would later write one of the war's most famous summaries of the battle: "Before Alamein, we survived. After Alamein, we conquered." That statement, like Montgomery's comment about Rommel making a balls of it, captured something essential about Alamein's place in the war. The battle was not the largest of the war. The Eastern Front dwarfed it in scale. It was not the most tactically brilliant. Montgomery's methodical grinding attack lacked the elegance of German blitzkrieg or Soviet deep operations. But it was the turning point for Britain. It was the first major land victory over Germany. It proved that careful planning and material superiority could defeat German tactical skill. It shattered the myth of Axis invincibility in the minds of British soldiers, and it gave Britain a hero, a commander who could stand alongside Rommel and not only survive, but win. The pursuit that followed El Alamein would frustrate many observers. Montgomery advanced cautiously, prioritizing secure logistics over rapid movement. Rommel retreated across Libya, his forces battered but not destroyed. Critics argued that Montgomery should have pursued more aggressively, potentially trapping and annihilating the Afrika Korps before it could escape to Tunisia. Montgomery's defenders countered that his careful approach prevented Rommel from executing a counterattack, maintaining constant pressure without overextending British supply lines. The debate would continue for decades, but in terms of what Montgomery said when he realized the Afrika Korps was trapped, the historical record provides several key statements. There was the crude but accurate tactical assessment: "The Marshal has made a balls of it," spoken as the German retreat dissolved into chaos. There was the confident prediction before the battle: "We will attack when ready and not before," reflecting his methodical approach. There was the defiant declaration upon taking command: "If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead," establishing the psychological foundation for victory. And there was his subsequent summary of the battle to his troops: "Together we have gained the confidence of this great army and gone forward to final victory in Africa," claiming collective success while maintaining his position as the architect of that success. What Montgomery did not say is equally revealing. He did not praise Rommel's generalship. He did not emphasize luck. or chance. He did not credit ultra-intelligence intercepts, though they had provided invaluable information about German plans and logistics. He did not dwell on the crucial role of air superiority, which had strangled Rommel's supply lines and massacred German columns. Instead, Montgomery's public statements emphasized planning, preparation, and the execution of a deliberate strategy. In Montgomery's narrative, El Alamein was not a close-run thing or a fortunate turn of events. It was the inevitable result of superior command. This self-confidence, bordering on arrogance, would characterize Montgomery's public persona for the rest of the war and his life. His subordinates often found him difficult and demanding. His superiors frequently clashed with him over strategy and command relationships. American generals, particularly Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, would develop intense personal animosity toward Montgomery, viewing him as insufferably pompous. In later campaigns, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Market Garden, Montgomery's cautious, methodical approach would generate controversy and criticism. But at El Alamein in October and November 1942, Montgomery's approach worked. His careful planning, his accumulation of overwhelming force, his methodical execution, his unshakable confidence, all proved exactly what the situation required. The Eighth Army needed a commander who would stand firm, prepare thoroughly, and grind the enemy down through superior resources and careful tactics. Montgomery provided that command, and when the Afrika Korps finally broke and retreated, when Rommel's mystique shattered against British positions, Montgomery permitted himself that brief crude assessment. The Marshal has made a balls of it. Liavar. The trapped Afrika Korps, fleeing westward across the desert, left behind 30,000 prisoners, 500 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 400 guns captured, and uncounted dead. The German and Italian forces would eventually regroup in Tunisia, where they would fight on for another 6 months before final surrender in May 1943. But they would never again threaten Egypt or the Suez Canal. The high water mark of Axis expansion in North Africa had been reached and rolled back. For the soldiers of the Eighth Army, El Alamein represented vindication. They had fought well in previous battles, but Rommel had always seemed to find a way to win. Now finally they had stood their ground, executed their orders, and watched the enemy break. The victory restored their confidence and their pride. They began calling themselves the Desert Rats, adopting the herboa as their insignia, claiming the desert as their own rather than Rommel's. Montgomery encouraged this identity, understanding that armies fight better when they believe in themselves. For Britain as a nation, El Alamein provided desperately needed good news. After 3 years of war, the list of defeats and withdrawals had grown depressingly long. Dunkirk, Greece, Crete, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, Tobruk. British forces had fought bravely, but seemed unable to match German operational skill. El Alamein changed that narrative. Church bells rang across England for the first time since 1940, celebrating the victory. Newspapers hailed Montgomery as a genius. The public embraced him as a hero, the general who had finally beaten the Germans. Montgomery himself, characteristically, saw the battle as confirmation of his military philosophy. He had argued throughout his career that modern warfare required careful preparation, detailed planning, and overwhelming force applied methodically. Romantic notions of brilliant improvisation or daring maneuvers were, in his view, recipes for disaster. Wars were won by commanders who accumulated superiority and then used it efficiently. El Alamein proved that approach could work against Germany's best generals. The political and strategic consequences of El Alamein extended beyond North Africa. The battle occurred simultaneously with Operation Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa farther west in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel now faced enemies on 2 fronts, trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from Egypt and Allied forces pushing eastward from Algeria and Morocco. The German command had to divert troops and resources to Tunisia that might otherwise have reinforced other theaters. The Mediterranean, previously dominated by Axis air and naval forces, gradually came under Allied control. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were beginning their counteroffensive at Stalingrad. Within weeks, the German 6th Army would be trapped and ultimately destroyed. Germany was experiencing the first major defeats of the war on two fronts simultaneously. The tide was turning, though years of brutal fighting remained ahead. El Alamein and Stalingrad, occurring almost concurrently, marked the beginning of Germany's long defensive struggle. When Montgomery stood in his command post on November 4, 1942, watching reports of the Afrika Korps collapse flow in, he could not have fully understood all these strategic implications, but he understood that he had accomplished what he set out to do. He had transformed a defeated army into a victorious one. He had trapped Rommel at El Alamein by refusing to retreat, by accumulating overwhelming force, by attacking methodically, and by grinding down the enemy through superior resources. The Desert Fox, who had seemed unbeatable, had been beaten. Montgomery's crude remark, "The Marshal has made a balls of it," encapsulated his professional assessment. Rommel had failed, not through lack of courage or tactical skill, but because he had been outplanned and outfought by a commander who understood that modern industrial warfare favored preparation over improvisation, arithmetic over artistry. But perhaps the more revealing statement was the one Montgomery made 3 months earlier, standing before his officers in that fly-infested command post, declaring the Army's new reality. "Here we will stand and fight. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead." That declaration established the foundation for everything that followed. By eliminating the option of retreat, Montgomery forced his army to win. And by accumulating the resources and planning the battle methodically, he made that victory inevitable. The trapped Afrika Korps, fleeing westward under constant air attack, represented the culmination of that strategy. Rommel had been drawn into a battle of attrition in a confined space where maneuver was impossible and material superiority decisive. Montgomery had created the conditions for victory, then executed his plan with ruthless efficiency. When the trap closed, when the German line broke, when the Afrika Korps ran, Montgomery allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had said they would stand and fight at El Alamein. They had stood, they had fought, and they had won. The Desert Fox was trapped and beaten, not through genius, but through preparation, not through luck, but through logistics, not through inspiration, but through the application of overwhelming force, directed by a clear plan executed patiently. That was Montgomery's way of war, and at El Alamein it worked perfectly.